our guests this morning are Professor Katherine and Professor Christy Cobb, who are the co editors of the recently released volume, Slavery and its New Testament Contexts. So, make her debut to the program is Professor Katherine Shaner. Katherine is Associate Professor of New Testament at Wake Forest University School of Divinity. She is the author of Enslaved Leadership in Early Christianity, and it's a pleasure to have her on the show. So, Katherine,
Thank you.
welcome. Absolutely. Very excited to have you on the show. Very much appreciate your work, and we'll get further into that. Um, and returning to the show is Dr. Christy Cobb. Christy is Assistant Professor of Christianity at the University of Denver. She is the author. She is the author of Slavery, Gender, Truth, and Power in Luke Acts and Other Ancient Narratives. So, Christy, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. I thoroughly enjoyed this volume, and I'm looking forward to discussing it today. So let's just kind of get into it. But before we do, um, I feel like we need to kind of talk about the history of research for a bit, um, and the reason why is because it's often shocking when people find out about the ubiquity of slavery in the ancient Mediterranean world, but even more so in the context of the New Testament. However, most, if not all, of these early Christian writings were created using the invisible, unpaid labor of slaves, right? So, as we shall see, slaves acted as scribes, couriers, servers, and much more for prominent figures, most notably um, Paul of Tarsus. But even after Christianity rose to prominence with Constantine, slavery never really went away. There's this concept, an idea in people's minds that Christianity became more egalitarian and slavery kind of just went the wayside. But I would argue that it morphed into different forms and justifications, melding these Aristotelian conceptions of slavery with ancient ethnographic concerns in later thinkers such as Albertus Magnus. So, and I apologize for being long winded, but through the work of scholars such as Jennifer Glacy and more recently Candida Moss and our two guests here today, the story of these voiceless and faceless are beginning to see the rays of light. So, Christy, Katherine, um, give us some background to the scholarship on ancient slavery in the New Testament and why it's important to utilize cross disciplinary approaches in telling these stories.
You can start with that one, I think.
Well, I think I'm going to start with my own realization about ancient slavery back when I was in graduate school. I was, of course, reading Jennifer Glacy, but I kept wondering, I'm also, okay, let me back up. I'm also a literature nerd, right? So I love Toni Morrison. I love historical fiction. Not that they're in the same genre, but one of the things that became really clear to me was that we couldn't just talk about slaves in the ancient world, because when we did that, we took away some of the humanity in those enslaved people. And part of, as a feminist historian, part of my job is to make us recognize and realize that the voices we get in usual histories are often not marginalized voices. And there are so many voices that are left out. There are so many voices that don't show up in our usual texts. The texts that come down to us are usually ones that are either preserved by the elite or written by the elite. And the Bible is no exception to that. So part of what I wanted to do was to help create a history of enslaved people's reality and lives, right? Instead of what the enslavers thought of enslaved people.
And then to kind of continue that, I think what Catherine's saying is exactly right. Like the history of New Testament scholarship has been one that has focused on the elite. And so if you go to sort of the bulk of New Testament commentaries that were, say, published 20 years ago, or, even sooner than that, you're going to read through and you're going to see that they're not mentioning enslaved persons, right? And often when they are, it's in this sort of the light of an analogy or a metaphor about slavery. And so that becomes it makes the enslaved persons invisible within our scholarship and within our text. And I think that's why, Jason, the second part of your question is important, which is the why to use a cross-disciplinary, reading in our work. And that's because the history of New Testament scholarship has not engaged with enslavement or enslaved voices. Now, recently we have so much, good work, as you've mentioned, a couple of scholars, and in the last, 20, 25 years, more and more scholarship has been written within New Testament scholarship. But when we look at, say, the field of classics, we can learn quite a lot about ancient slavery and the realities of ancient slavery within that literature. And then, as Katherine mentioned, I think, literature, fiction can tell us quite a lot. I've been sort of diving in recently to the scholarship on transatlantic slavery, especially because that overlaps with my work on gender. There's just tons of scholars who've been working on enslaved women in the transatlantic world. And so reading that really helps me to emphasize the agency of enslaved persons in antiquity and within the New Testament.
Yeah, and I'm gonna pull one more discipline in here because we haven't talked about theology, and as a also a theologian, I feel like I need to pull in theology here because I think one of the things that's at stake for us in this history, in this cross-disciplinary study of ancient slavery in the New Testament, is the foundation of Christian theology, right? And so part of once I started seeing slaves in the historical record, I started seeing how much slavery was inculcated into our basic theologies within Christianity. And for me, there's a corrective that we need to work on there. There's a reparation to be made there.
Absolutely. I think in all things in terms of this the approaches to slavery in antiquity, I think that the importance is always to as with feminist theology, as with the uh, using epigraphical evidence as opposed to this oration by Dio of Chrysostom or Dio Chrysostom of Prusa or whatever, or Plutarch on Isis and Osiris. I think it's important to read this evidence against the grain where possible and look for these aspects where it's important to see that these slaves are letting their voices out despite being silenced by the uh, major narrative that kind of encapsulates the world that they live in. Um, and that's what's great about the volume. Like you said, there's a lot of cross disciplinary approaches that are important in this. I think I froze up there for a second. Sorry, one second. What happened there? Oh, maybe it's just me, but I'll keep going.
Oh, your video is
Sorry, we're
frozen, but we
live,
can
everybody.
hear you just fine.
Okay, that's so strange. One second, let me try this. I don't know. Well, you'll have to look on this not so flattering picture of me while I keep going. But the volume approaches the subject from several different angles. Christy, you approach it from gender and sexuality. Catherine, you talk a lot about the household codes and the philosophical concepts that went into the um, running of the household. But also, it tackles the subject from the angle of economics and material and cultural history. So, can you discuss these subjects and angles a bit further?
Yeah. So when Catherine and I were planning this volume, we were really thinking about how it would teach, right? My much of my experience in the classroom is with undergraduate students, though I'm now teaching graduate students as well, but I have a lot of experience in undergraduate classrooms. And Catherine teaches at a divinity school, right? So Masters of Divinity students as well. And so we both of us taught slavery in the classroom, and both of us we were struggling with exactly which text to use and how to do it. So we set this book up to work in a classroom really well, I think. And so the first section of the book is the sort of historical background. So we see this as these are the kind of things you need to know before diving into a sort of critical analysis of passages in the New Testament that deal with slavery. So it begins with these two sort of what we might call mini chapters that talk about the language of enslavement. And just how to approach slavery. And then we have several chapters that give this historical background. So, the slavery in the Roman world, a chapter on law and material culture, um, ancient Jewish slavery, which is really important to the context of the New Testament as well. This how slave labor and the slave trade. So, how did people become enslaved? And then we move into these sort of like let's say topical approaches or thematic approaches as you mentioned. So gender and sexuality, there's a chapter on race and ethnicity, on metaphors, the household codes, right? And then the very end of the book turns to what we might say is sort of the repercussions of slavery. So what happens in early Christianity? What are early Christians and the church fathers doing with this? And then we even have a chapter on the influences of slavery like around the globe, right?
Hmm.
So that was our sort of thought process behind the volume and what chapters we included, which we thought through pretty carefully. Yeah. Do you want to add something to that, Catherine?
Well, I would say throughout, one of the other features of the book that I think is really interesting that touches on Christie's and my research both, is that you're right, Jason. It's about material culture, right? So, enslavement isn't just a theoretical concept or something that's found in literature. There are ways to trace it in the material world as well. And that's been part of what I've done as a scholar is to say, hey, wait a minute, we've got some material evidence here, and we need to juxtapose that a lot of times with our literary evidence, and that gives us still a different window into how the world of um, ancient Roman slavery actually worked.
Absolutely. I think that we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And looks like my camera's working, so uh, it's a good thing. But before getting into the case studies, because I thought this would be an interesting exercise. But before we get into the case studies themselves that I have prepared, we should probably discuss briefly the historical milieu of the High Roman Empire, which is roughly the first to late second centuries Common Era, the time during which the early Christian texts were written and transmitted. So tell us about the importance and ubiquity of slavery as a wheel of the machinery of the empire.
Mm.
Economically, super important. And like you said, Catherine and Christy, there's a lot of material evidence. There's uh, owners' manuals, on how to treat your slaves. There's evidence on how you would buy a slave, maintain a slave, of course, the household codes, Catherine. So tell us a bit about this.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that I want to go back to the scholarship a little bit because comparison with New World slavery, with transatlantic slavery, is often one of the things that folks talk about. Well, we can't really do that, but it's no accident that when you go back to read Cato's on agriculture, or when you go back to read Varro's De Re Rustica, it's no accident that it sounds a lot like Thomas Jefferson, right? And so um, are the architects of New World slavery, of uh, the transatlantic slave trade, the architects of that were reading all of this stuff within the Roman Empire. And why? Because the only way that the Roman Empire can get to be as wealthy and as powerful as it is through a system of enslavement. Right? So you've got wars on all the peripheries of the Roman Empire, and that's just feeding the slave trade because all the war captives who aren't, to be celebrated in victory marches in the city of Rome, they're the ones who then go to the slave markets. So, and then you start to see another phenomenon happening, is in the on the Italian peninsula, particularly as the empire is getting rolling, you start to see consolidation of the states. And once you have consolidation of the states, you have bigger and bigger groups of enslaved people who are needed in order to run those estates profitably. And so that's where you get some of these instructions from, say, Cato, where he's like, yeah, only give a certain amount of wine. And if it's fig season, drop down the rations because they'll just eat some figs anyway. Right. it, I'm embellishing a bunch, but the consolidation of wealth that happens in the Roman Empire can only happen with enslavement as um, the labor structure.
And I'll add to that that I mean, I think all of this is so important to know, and also, um, there has been some research done by scholars that have shown that, you didn't have to be super wealthy in the Roman world to own a slave, right? You could, a sort of, I don't know, low middle class family might have even been able to afford 1, maybe 2, especially a domestic enslaved worker inside the house, and then, of course, um, women, and we're gonna get into this in a little bit, but were often used for breeding for, so in addition to the ways that, Catherine just mentioned about sort of obtaining enslaved workers and that labor force, if you have one enslaved worker in your house and that person is female, then she has a child, then you have a second enslaved worker in your house, So, there was a way that slavery touched sort of every facet of the Roman world.
I think that's a great point, Christy. And even in the cities themselves had slaves. I was having discussion with a classicist named Jerry Toner, who wrote a book called "The Romans' Guide to Slave Management," and it's a fictionary account, but he takes the evidence from Varro, from Cato, to create this slave guide. And Catherine was saying she was kind of exaggerating when she was talking about the rations, but it's really not off by much. Like it really is kind of, you only give them one cloak every 6 months or whatever, or one pair of when it's the summer you give them more grain, but otherwise they'll get too uppity. It's really, there's an anxiety in this elite male um, culture of leisure and rhetoric and all these things that we were talking about that most scholars draw on when they talk about antiquity, that is reflected in these manuals, which is very interesting. So in the book, it's really interesting because after every chapter, there are questions for the students. Um, I assume this book was written for mostly the classroom, if I'm correct,
Mhm.
from reading it. If y'all could kind of talk about that a bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
You
So,
Right.
yeah, so Christy and I, we were on a Zoom call over the pandemic, and so way back when, remember, um, we were on a Zoom call together and realized that neither of us had a textbook that we could just sort of pull off the shelf and hand to our students. And so, part of the reason we wanted to write this was not only to get experts to talk about the thing they were expert in. So, Ulrika Roth writes the chapter on slave trade and labor, and she's incredible, an incredible scholar on those particular topics. But we also asked them to write only 5,000 words, and we asked them to let us edit it. And so part of the goal of this book really was to make readable prose, so that an 18-year-old can pick it up and understand it, which is not always the case with scholarship, right? So we were very, very focused on making sure this was an accessible book.
And I'll just add to that, I mean, we also did hope that it would be a resource for people outside the classroom too, right? Because it is the kind of book you could just read one chapter in one sitting if you're interested in knowing more about a particular aspect of slavery, or you can read the whole thing if you're unfamiliar with the intricacies of ancient slavery and interested in it in the New Testament. For example, a pastor who might be preaching sermons and has realized that, the sermons are engaging texts that discuss slavery, then they might grab this book and then be able to understand the sort of foundational aspects of slavery, which can impact, their ministry or their personal life, all of those things, right?
Wonderful. Well, yes, I think that it did a great job. And in the spirit of the pedagogical mission of the book, I thought we would take some kind of case studies. Now, I want people to keep in mind that these case studies, when I talk about the hold on, add to stage. Sorry, I don't use Google Slides, so I think that's what's the issue with the StreamYard. But please bear with me, everybody. I'm not tech savvy. But in the spirit of this kind of pedagogical mission, I thought that it would be good to look at some case studies. Now, please keep in mind that these slaves are usually, we don't know their names. Their stories are only hypothetical from the epigraphical evidence or otherwise. Um, but I thought we'd look at, three case studies of women who were enslaved in different situations within a household. So, this first one, Christy, this will actually go back to our first talk on women, power, the voice in the New Testament text. But
Mhm.
I decided to call this person who's holding the mirror down here, Fortunata. So, Fortunata is a longtime slave of an elite woman in Asia Minor. Um, so, tell us a little bit about what her hypothetical situation would have been like. How would power dynamics, what is defined as kyriarchy in the volume and by other scholars, how would that have defined her relationship with her owner?
Mm. I think when looking at these kind of depictions, one of the first things to note is the sort of size of the two figures, right? So when we look at this particular image, the you know taller elite woman is in the center. She is the focal point of this funerary monument. She's the deceased. We can tell a little bit about her from the clothing, from the way in which she's presented, right, with this head covering and sort of her full body dress, and then also the way she's sort of standing facing the viewer, right? The enslaved woman, which is, she is much smaller, and we might even look at her and think that's a child, right? And that depiction was intentional by the artist who made this, because what the technique that art historians use to call this is hierarchical scaling, which is basically that the people who are viewed as less important on the hierarchy are usually minimized. And so in this particular image, we see this enslaved, person, and she looks very young. And one of the things I would say is, let's not assume that the enslaved person or enslaved woman who's enslaved to this elite woman is young. We don't know for sure. We know, it's hard to know, but these images were often made to be smaller purposefully in order to decrease her importance, which addresses the power dynamics at play. Um, do you wanna add something there, Catherine? I don't wanna take over the.
No, I mean, I think you're more familiar with this monument than I am. And so I'm looking at the image and observing a few things, and you've already pointed some of them out. One is that the taller woman has so much more volume to her clothing, right? And textiles are really expensive in the ancient world. So this is a woman, at least in terms of the rhetoric of her depiction, who has a lot of cash because she can afford not only an undergarment, like the undergarment, but then that wrap all the way around. And you notice the only thing that's showing is the one hand and her face, and a little bit of her hair. But her hair is fairly complicated in its hairstyle too. So we get signals, rhetorical signals, I would argue, or not argue, but point out these are rhetorical symbols of how this woman wants to portray herself, and we don't know anything about the real woman who's behind this picture. And that's what's really interesting when we start to move to archaeology, because sometimes we start to think that these images tell us more than the texts do because they're more like windows into real life. But they're just as rhetorical as our texts are. And Christie's pointed some of that out with the shorter woman looking like a child, but that's a rhetoric of enslavement, right? Because enslaved people are not mature enough, right? Don't have enough rationality, reason, don't have enough virtue to be full adults, right? And so you see that rhetoric.
And then to add to that, as far as the enslaved woman of that she is pictured there, the whole purpose of this rhetoric that Catherine's pointing out is to uplift the female enslaver, the deceased woman. So the whole purpose there, she's facing her, she's holding two objects, a fan on her like lower arm and then a jewelry box on the upper arm. Both of these are meant to show like she is there for the beauty and the comfort of her enslaver. That's her purpose of being there. She's also sort of looking up in this way that might impact a viewer in the ancient world might have looked at this and said, "Oh, this enslaved woman really cared about her deceased enslaver." So it's performing virtue, right? It's saying she was a good enslaver. She was a kind, a benevolent enslaver. And all of that is rhetoric, as Catherine is saying. Like, we can't know, but exactly what was happening behind the scenes, but we can read this and it can provide for us the information that we can say, well, if we want to read this against the grain, just like we might read a text,
Mhm.
we might say that we should resist that view that this enslaver was kind. We should recognize that enslavers were manipulative in lots of ways, were violent in lots of ways, right? And that even if this image portrays to us that the enslaved woman is looking up and is sad that she has died and is here with her objects of comfort and beauty and right towards her enslaver, that she was still in trapped in a situation of enslavement in this woman's house.
And I'm glad that you brought up the infantilizing aspect of this image. And but actually, before I get into that, I think that it's extremely important to point out that yes, the funerary monuments, just like the epigraphical habit of this period of time, are all performative. They're all trying to express something about how you either fit in or don't fit into this empire as a whole. I had a discussion with a scholar named Lindsay Mazurk on uh, Isiac portrayal, how women portrayed themselves in Isiac garb on their funerary monuments, and how this was used to express alterity. So yeah, all these visual texts, so to speak, are saying something about how the viewer wants to be remembered and how they want to project themselves and their family. Um, and but just to get to the infantilizing aspect of this image, I think it's also reflected in the names for the what these slaves were called, right? Like a female slave is a paidiske, you know, and the the male slaves are like, a pice, like, like a boy, like in that derogatory sense. So I think it's reflected in the language as well and how these slaves were referred to. So um, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and that's actually one of the issues with studying slavery in the ancient world is how do you decide on the vocabulary about it? And just like in English, it's slippery, right? I mean, if you read antebellum literature, they talk about the servants on the plantation. Well, they're not servants, they're slaves. And you have the same issue with Greek. The word doulos is often translated as servant, but it really does mean slave. And paidiske, those could be either way, right? It could be young child or it could be enslaved person. I think teknon is sometimes used in that sense also, but it's slippery because especially with pes and pediske and teknon, um, they can also refer to free children, freeborn children as well. So it's slippery in that rhetoric is trying to show that, oh, look, the slavery must not be so bad if they're just like our kids.
Mm.
Except that you might call a 40-year-old woman a pediske, right? Or a 30-year-old man a teknon, um, which isn't so great, just generally speaking.
Christy, did you have anything to add to that before we move on?
No, I mean, I could talk about the language stuff for a long time. Well, let's see what I could add here is, well, even when the language for the enslaved person is also is infantilizing, as we've talked about, but also I think we can problematize the language of enslavers. So thinking of curios, curie, this idea of the enslaver, which is often is translated as Lord, and that's a part of where the metaphors of enslavement come into play when the disciples call Jesus their Lord. They are embodying that language of enslavement because that word can also mean enslaver, person who enslaves, right? Enslaves others. And so that kind of language is also really important to discuss and just sort of like pick apart.
Absolutely. Thank you both for that answer. So we're going to move on to our next slide and our next hypothetical case study. So I named this one Felicitas. So Felicitas is a servant, and Catherine, this question is more tailored towards your work on the household codes. Sorry, I can't speak today. In your previous book and in the volume here. So Felicitas is a servant in a wealthy household in southern Italy. So what would her situation have been like? Where would she fit into the hierarchy of the household code?
Ooh. Yeah, so I want to just know I'm sitting here admiring the mosaic, right? This is a skilled mosaicist who's created this particular image. Um, One of the things that I want to note is that this particular enslaved image is of a woman who's holding a big urn on her back, and it must be heavy if she's holding it on her back instead of in front of her. So one of the things that I think we need to think about when we think about enslaved women in the household is that they weren't doing just nice little domestic tasks like, wielding a spatula in the kitchen or um, they were doing heavy, sweaty, strength needing kinds of labor. When I look at Felicitas as well, and I realize that the image isn't on the screen anymore because I think we might have lost Jason, but I'll keep talking about her. Because when we think about enslaved women who are in a household, one of the issues that comes up is to whom are they beholden, right? So in the rhetoric of slavery, in the laws of slavery, whoever owns you, whoever is your enslaver, is the person to whom you're beholden for your livelihood. And they have the power under Roman law of life and death over you. Um, but your father also has the same power if you're an unmarried daughter. Your husband, if you are married, could possibly have that same power over you as well if you're a woman in antiquity. And so all of a sudden, what we start to see is an issue with the household codes because this woman, perhaps she has a father. Perhaps she was born into the household that she's working in. She's got a father, but she's also got an enslaver. What happens if she needs to maybe care for her sick father who asks her to do that? And her enslaver says, no, you need to be moving the wine amphorae today. Who does she listen to if she's uh, underneath some of this rhetoric of the household codes? The truth is that I don't think the household codes really have much to do with everyday life. I think they are more about a rhetoric of political organization that uplifts the master, right? Uplifts the patriarch, the male head of the household, so that he can have leisure, so that he can be a scholar, so that he can govern in a democracy, right? I mean, so all of our rhetoric of democracy is often dependent on enslaved labor because you need folks who have the time to deliberate and the time to study governance decisions. We see a lot of that in Plato's Politics, and I could talk about that if you want. But um, the point is that this enslaved person, um, first of all, this is a rhetoric. She's being a good slave, right? So whoever's portraying her is portraying her as good and work worthy. But then the reality of her life, if we take her out of this mosaic, the reality of her life is not simple in terms of sort of the hierarchy of command, if you want to talk about it that way. She is beholden to so many different people that it would often be confusing to her. And I'll let Christy weigh in because I'm sure you've got some other observations.
Yeah, I mean, I'm particularly drawn to kind of the thing you noted about her labor being hard and difficult, um, and also the sort of varying jobs that a person might have. So when we think about, say, the New Testament, and Rhoda, who's in Acts chapter 12, and she's always noted to be a doorkeeper. And we might imagine, oh, that's the only thing she does all day is open the doors. But no, the reality is that she was likely running around carrying water, cooking, cleaning, right? Running errands, doing all sorts of other types of work and responsible for answering the door when guests were coming, when there was a gathering such as the one described in Acts chapter 12. And so this woman, who we're calling Felicitas, it's similar, right? And I like that you pointed out, Catherine, that the labor is not always would not have always been easy. And this goes to Mira Green's chapter from our book, where she sort of talks about the kitchens and the material culture, the material evidence that we can learn from examining an ancient kitchen, which is that an average person would have had to been stooped over, would have been in a room with fire close by, would have this would have taken a toll on a person's body, an enslaved woman's body, as they were preparing the meals. And that's only one part of their job in most cases, as you were saying.
And I think it's worth also noting that those who have women's bodies are often conscripted for reproductive labor, whether that is, that they need to be having babies to replace the slaves or grow the slave population in the house, which means that they're beholden sexually to their enslavers or to whoever their enslaver gives them to. But then, of course, there's the danger of childbirth. And then once they give birth, they become wet nurses, which means that they're not only nursing their own children, but any other children who are in the household as well. So, the toll, plus they, of course, have all of their other labor. So the toll that it takes on a female body simply to exist in this space is, I think, not something we should take for granted or something that we should diminish.
Mm, yeah, so true.
Sorry. Absolutely, and I think that that's a great point to make about, again, these elite males who have these vast estates and who now, because they're not in the Senate all day arguing over rhetorical matters, they have all this time to work on their otium or their leisure and how best to manage their slaves and their estates and things like that. And a good example that always comes up for me is somebody like Pliny the Younger. If you look at his epistles, he's always constantly trying to juggle in his mind, how best to balance work and leisure, and how best to balance, how does an elite person spend their time. So, yeah, great point to make. Great points. And we're going to move on now to the third case study. And this one, I just want to point out for some people, it might be a little bit more. Um, just because it's going to be talking about sex work. So it might be, if you have younger people watching, it might be appropriate to kind of uh, watch what we're going to be talking about now, so that they're not watching. But so this is, I called this one Perseus. So Perseus is a sex laborer, a porne in a brothel in Pompeii. So tell us a little bit about what her situation would have been like. How would she have found ways to subtly resist her situation with her clients and her enslavers?
So, yeah, we've learned a lot recently about brothels from the work of Sarah Levin Richardson, who has this book where she sort of goes into this purpose-built brothel in Pompeii. and explores it and analyzes it from all sorts of angles, but especially thinking through the sort of the experience of a sex laborer. This one is female. There would have also been male sex laborers, sex workers in a brothel as well. And so, what Sarah Levin Richardson says is that we should, at least in the brothel in Pompeii, which can give us insight to other brothels as well. Imagine the space is lively, people coming in and out, right? Um, Sex is happening, of course, and other sort of sexual services are being purchased as well. But then there was also people doing their hair, helping each other, with their body, with their makeup, with their hair, going to fetch water, and bringing it back into the brothel, eating, drinking. As you can actually see on this image, there's a table with some cups and it looks like maybe a bowl, right? So we can imagine the brothel as a space where all of these things are happening in addition to sex, right? And really, we should say forced, right? Forced sex in these situations. And another aspect that Sarah Levin Richardson does is analyzes the graffiti from the walls of this brothel. And she notes that many of the names, this is going back to our conversation, Jason, about the names of enslaved persons as well, but in the sort of language, many of the names were of people who were enslaved, but there were some enslaved um, or some sex workers who would have not been enslaved, according to her research, right? So a percentage that might not have been. And so we might have a variety of statuses inside of a brothel. Many enslaved persons, in addition to some who might not have been and have found themselves in this situation. And then, of course, the uh, customers that come into the brothel in order to, to find their sexual needs met through this youth, right? And so this is one way we can kind of peek inside of an ancient brothel and think about the dynamics inside of theirs from this research, from analyzing what what the brothel looks like, as well as the graffiti and images such as this, which are again rhetorically presenting a certain image of a sex worker or sex laborer.
Yeah, and you asked Jason about resistance, and as I'm listening to and learning more and more about sex workers, I can imagine that there's some subtle forms of resistance that could be at work here. You know, we often think about, well, first of all, it's worth saying that in the ancient world, nudity was everywhere. Like, so nudity isn't the shocking thing to people, but we often forget about how vulnerable people are when they're nude. So I can imagine that a sex worker is actually seeing a client in some of their most vulnerable spaces. Now, that's not to say that the sex worker would take advantage necessarily of every vulnerability, because of course the backlash is awful. But a savvy sex worker might know how to take advantage of someone's vulnerability while they're nude. Um, you could also sort of you also see in some other graffiti that the sex workers will make fun of their clients, right? They'll talk about, Solitarius really likes blah 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 instead of, normal sex. Or, they'll have these jokes about their clients. And you can see where that could subtly start a whisper network within the city, that might actually damage somebody's reputation. I could also see a sex worker using some of the tactics that we know from New World slavery, from antebellum slavery, things like taking a few extra coins, right? And sort of telling the client it's one price, but really their enslaver is only expecting them to get another price, and their price was a little inflated, so they get a couple extra coins in their pocket. Or there'd be a slowdown, right? Of, well, that client took a while to do what he wanted to do, and so I just had to slow down a little bit. Right? And so then you subtly resist by slowing down the pace of work.
Yeah,
Uh,
a great oh, sorry, Christy, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna add to that, and that's really great. But the money piece is a really interesting part of this that Catherine's sort of mentioning, because there are a couple of sort of Roman writers who mention, oh, the fear of a sex laborer purchasing her own freedom, right?
Mhm.
And this idea that what it either her sort of taking more money than the job technically costs or whatever, or but also her being paid a percentage in the form what we call a peculium in the ancient world, where she's getting a percentage too and then saving it up. And so I love this sort of aspect of talking about resistance in this, what would have likely been a pretty difficult situation for these
Mhm.
people.
Absolutely, and I think that, as you both were kinda going through the resistance, the subtle resistance, I think, this is, of course, a problematic, um, piece of evidence from antiquity because, of course, it's from an elite male, but, I think of something like from l the literary evidence, Lucian's Dialogue of the Courtesans, which is,
Mhm.
it's all about, like, these different gossipy, discussions between, um, uh, the women about, their lovers and things like that. But yeah, just very interesting. So let's get into the early Christian example literature examples. And sorry, everybody, my camera's having issues for some reason tonight. I think it's the slides, but we soldier forward. So there is a rhetoric of enslavement to Christ and God in these texts, especially in Paul. However, Catherine, as you point out in a fantastic article that I read recently, we have evidence of this being quite a common occurrence in antiquity. So you utilize epigraphic evidence, such as a petitioner of Demeter calling himself a slave and suppliant, as well as an inscription um, from Apollo's temple in Didyma where it calls the slaves the boys of the god. So, can you tell us about this, and especially if you could draw in some weak comparison to how Paul uses this language in Philippians and Galatians?
Yeah. Oh, wow. Yes, I
Tall
can
order,
do
yes.
all that. No, I mean, so the lead inscription in this article, that's in Roman religions of the Roman Empire. The lead inscription in this is a petitioner who's saying to Demeter, "Look, I'm your slave. Can you help me with my slaves?" Right? And so you've got that juxtaposition of this is an enslaver who is petitioning his God for help with his enslaved people. And so part of what I wanted to point out was that you have this tension of enslaved laborers in the Didyma temple, right? So it talks about the boys of the temple. Well, they are listed along with material supplies for building that temple, right? So you need 5 marble stones and 10 iron pins and 15 slaves, right? 15 boys in order to do that day's task. And so you have these enslaved laborers who are owned by the god and the sanctuary. But then you also have folks who are saying, but I'm a slave to the god even as a free person. And so when we get to Philippians and Galatians, we hear a lot of this language from Paul about Paul being a slave to Jesus Christ Jesus. And he calls himself that in Philippians, he calls himself that at the beginning of Romans. Um, but he's also really clear that he owes nobody anything, especially in Galatians, right? So we don't think Paul was enslaved in real life, like IRL, as the kids say. He wasn't legally enslaved to anyone, but this metaphor of enslavement becomes a really important piece of Paul's own self identity. And part of it is he's trying to show how dedicated he is to his work, how dedicated he is to Christ Jesus. But he's also willing to use that metaphor to wield it, especially in Galatians, in ways that then objectify particularly women and particularly women's bodies. And Marianne Kartzow talks about this in her chapter in our book about metaphor and sexuality, or metaphor and women in the New Testament. And one of the things that I think is really difficult for folks to come to terms with in the New Testament is that Paul isn't innocent in using that enslavement metaphor. Neither are the folks in the ancient world. The metaphor means something precisely because readers know exactly what enslavement is and they know about the exploitation of enslavement.
Absolutely. Thank you for that answer. Um, so let's get into the Gospels themselves. Slaves, of course, are all over the Gospels, but Luke especially stands out. Especially after reading this volume, I was although I was aware of it, I was not aware of how strongly slaves and the viewpoint of the enslavers were portrayed, especially in these parables that Luke gives, right? So can you discuss the many parables found in Luke, and especially how they portray slaves and the likely perspective of Luke's implied readers? Would they have been more sympathetic to the slaves or the enslavers? Um, yeah, because like I said, I just found this very fascinating. Especially, I felt this was important to point out. Um, so Luke chapter 17, verse 7. Um, Jesus has the saying, and people tend to think of Jesus as this very egalitarian person who's inclusive of everybody. And there are, of course, sayings like that that do say that tax collectors, sinners are welcome into the kingdom of God. But he also has some. Luke also writes something like this, where Jesus says, "Who among you would say to your slave who has just come in from plowing or tending sheep in the field, 'Come here at once and take your place at the table'? Would you not rather say to him, 'Prepare supper for me, put on your apron, and serve me, while I eat and drink? Later you may eat and drink.' Do you thank the slave for doing what was commanded? So also, when you have done all that you were ordered to do, say, 'We are worthless slaves. We have done only what we ought to have done.'" That was it.
It's so
Sorry.
hard to hear.
Oh,
But
I apologize.
I mean, even if I've written about it, it's so hard to hear that in Jesus's voice. And yet, like, look at the ways that he's entering into enslaver rhetoric. He's assuming the disciples would operate this way, right? He's assuming that the disciples would not would expect their enslaved people to serve them. He's also assuming that enslaved people are you should get as much labor out of them as you possibly can. He's also assuming cleanliness, right? I mean, think about coming in from the field or being with sheep all day, right? You're gonna not smell real great. But of course, he wants the enslaved person to put on their apron and serve nicely, probably while the enslaver gets to clean themselves off, right, and feel a little bit better about who they are in the world. And it's so frustrating then to see Jesus also say, "This is worthless work." It's only reifying so many of the enslavement, exploitation moves and rhetorics of enslavers in antiquity and even today. Um, so that particular saying is just such a difficult one because we want to see it metaphorically, but there's so many ways in which it trades on all of the literal exploitative labor practices of enslavement in the ancient world.
Um, I'll just pipe in here. I mean, I think that that's exactly right. And these, especially with the parables, that's what's happening, right? Is that it is um perpetuating the economic exploitation of enslaved workers, right? And we see that over and over again. And then another example from Luke, which is not in a parable, but that Catherine and I use in our introductory chapter, is the story of Malchus, who's this basically this enslaved man who's enslaved to the high priest, and he comes with the group that's going to arrest Jesus. Is there in all four gospels. The synoptics Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and also John. And one of the things we do in the sort of opening of the book is to talk about this story because, well, it's not exactly a parable. It's just, at least within the Gospels, it's describing an enslaved person who would be forced to come along in this moment, and one of the disciples slices his ear off, right? And this is again in all four Gospels. And only Luke has Jesus heal the man's ear, right? So Matthew, Mark, and John, this person is left with, no ear, right? Is really violent. We should be this is a really violent scene. And then Luke's Jesus reaches down, picks up the ear, heals it, right? And often this is interpreted as sort of a Jesus that's being caring, right? That Luke's Jesus is caring for the oppressed. But I think one other way of viewing it is that Luke's Jesus is healing him in order that he might go back to work, so he can be a better enslaved worker, right? Or a complete one, right? Because he's not freed in that scene. Luke's Jesus doesn't free him; he heals him, and so we sort of, I think Katherine and I are using that story to question, like, there's a variety of ways we can view these texts and these stories. And we should be aware of these moments that this could be an act of healing by Luke's Jesus. It could also be further exploitation, right, of the enslaved worker.
Yeah, and I
Absolutely.
think
Oh, sorry. Go ahead,
I was gonna say
Catherine.
before we move off of Luke, I wanna add one piece to this story around the scholarship because um, I you know we can talk about the exploitation of enslaved people in Luke, but I have to note that this is about a context that we're trying to interject our interpretations into, right? The white feminist context. So for me, the white Protestant mainline context in particular, because I want to note the work of Mitzi Smith, who's a womanist scholar who's arguing that Mary, when she sings the Magnificat, Mary is admitting to being an enslaved woman, and therefore Jesus would be enslaved as well. And she creates a way in which that interpretation is absolutely necessary for her community, and for the solidarity of her own community as a womanist scholar. And I just want to note that we have to allow the possibility for those kinds of multiple interpretations, and that Christy and I are very aware that we are working for a particular audience who wants to diminish the impact of slavery for our own sake, right? Versus to wants to find some solidarity in slavery with Jesus.
Yeah, that's a great point to make, and I think actually I wanna stay on Luke for a bit longer because Luke is also the author of, Acts, and, Christy and I had a conversation last time about, the, various ways in which servants were or slaves were portrayed in Acts, and there's a one very particularly striking, situation that always stands out to me, when Paul, rebukes the slave with the spirit of the Pythia, and, where they kind of, he kinda takes away her livelihood just because she's proclaiming them as, they're, servants of the Most High, so it's like Paul's, like, annoyed by this, and that strikes me as well, and, just this perspective of how of course, we can't possibly know, but it seems very strongly to me I'm strongly convinced after reading, this volume that, Luke is written more from the perspective of the enslavers than the enslaved. So I you kind of wonder who the readers would have more sympathy for in all these parables and in all these portrayals of the slaves. Um, yeah, just one thing that I found very striking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, that in the enslaved sort of fortune teller in Philippi in Acts 16 is one that, she keeps, like popping up in my writing and in my teaching as well, because that story has so many different facets to it. And things that we've already addressed in this conversation, such as the economic exploitation, because the writer of Acts does say um, the enslavers made a great deal of money from her labor. So it's this, it's already there that they are, capitalizing on her labor. And then, of course, it does also point to the treatment and the infantilizing of enslaved persons, because she is called a pataske, that word that we've discussed earlier. And also Paul's treatment of her, which, as you mentioned, is really sort of just because he's annoyed, it seems, right? That he is going to remove her ability to work. And then finally, she disappears, right? We don't hear the whole story just moves to Paul and Silas and their treatment and the enslavers and the way they are feeling. And she just is, we don't know anything about what happens to her after the story. And so there's so many elements to that story in Acts that I don't know. It just can't, it does hasn't let go of me yet. That story.
Catherine, did you want to add anything?
I mean, one of the things, and Christy pointed this out, right? The Pataskate, she tells the truth. um, and she uses the metaphor. So here again, we go back to this metaphor, right? She uses the metaphor of Paul and Silas being slaves of the Most High while she's an enslaved person. And of course, there's no relief for her from her enslavement, even if the metaphorical enslavement to God is a relief for Paul and Silas. And that tension is just one you got to sit with for a good long while. Like,
For me, I think it's very the tension is extremely pronounced, especially after my studies over the past couple of years of this subject. Just um, the empty rhetoric almost of an elite person being an enslaved of a deity, but also still maintaining their power structures. Whereas somebody who is an enslaved person has no recourse to saying no to their master if he wants to have sex with them, whether that's a boy or a girl, right? Um, they have no recourse to not doing backbreaking labor in the fields on the the latifundia, right? So I think that it's become an extremely problematic aspect of reading these texts over the past few years. But I know we're running low on time, so I wanted to know if I could ask one more question before we go.
Of course.
So we're going to end on a kind of interesting note. Everybody loves the book of Revelation, right? So,
Do
um,
they?
well, certain people more than others, right? But the book of Revelation in chapter 17 through 19 portrays the porne of Babylon, the prostitute of Babylon. So tell us about how Revelation uses the imagery of an enslaved sex laborer for a bit to denigrate the empire, but also what does it kind of tell us about um, attitudes towards this profession as well?
Yeah, the use of porne here is certainly meant to be negative, right? To associate Rome, let's say, Babylon, with an enslaved sex laborer is meant to be degrading, right? Language to be used there. And and that section is pretty kind of graphic in its especially misogynistic language used there. And so I think that is, really important to note. A number of scholars have talked about the ways in which, some enslaved persons were branded or tattooed on their forehead, and the writer of Revelation uses that image as well, again, negatively associated with that. But then there have been some scholars, such as I'm thinking of Chanel Smith's work, who does a womanist reading of this passage, and and provides, I think what she calls like alternative readings of this passage that can show this woman of Babylon to be a more complex figure than at first glance, right?
Mhm.
Do you want to add to this, Catherine?
Well, I was gonna say it's also worth pointing out that in those very chapters where John the Seer is trying to is using that metaphor of the Porne of Babylon to desecrate the Roman Empire, he's also, when he gets to the cargo list where the kings of the earth who've committed fornication with her, like the kings of the earth are weeping because their cargo in their ships is going up in flames, right? Um, and one of the at the very end of that cargo list, it's this really dramatic list of like grapes and gold and myrrh and fabric and spices and all the really cool stuff, wormwood and human souls. That is enslaved people, right? Or bodies, somata. That is human souls. And when we get to that point in 1813, it's one of the few places where we actually get a critique of enslavement, right? Because there's a critique of the excess and the exploitation of the Roman Empire, and with it, it's a critique that they will buy and sell broker bodies, even as John the Seer is willing to use this female sex worker image as a way of tearing down the Roman Empire. I mean, the fastest way to destroy someone's reputation in antiquity and maybe even in today is to accuse them of sexual immorality, um, which may or may not have been true, right? I mean, so John's just using that very tried and true trope in order to destroy the Roman Empire, and even in ironic ways to try to show the exploitation in enslavement in the Roman Empire.
Absolutely. And I think that you can extend this metaphor and see the um complicated ways that these supposed most likely male authors are using these concepts of enslaved um, sex sex workers as even to the Nag Hammadi corpus, right? There's a lot of imagery of the soul being this fallen prostitute that is, given this way and that way to all the different. And it's a spiritual metaphor, right? Eventually, at the end of the day,
Mhm.
but it's very interesting. You could apply this to a lot of different texts, and especially apocryphal texts. But Christy and I have a talk on that already, so please go watch that one. Um, Justice for Euclid. But Catherine, Christy, this has been so fun. I apologize for the technical issues I had with my camera, but otherwise, it's been a great talk. If you have anything you want to plug, or if you feel we missed, it's a vast topic. We didn't even get into the concept of race and antiquity and how that tied into slavery, or the later reception of this. We touched upon it a little bit, but the later reception of this in the antebellum South and things like that. So it's a vast topic, but if y'all want to touch upon anything or plug anything, feel free to use this time.
Buy our book.
That is
It's with Erdman's, for anyone who's curious where they can find it.
Absolutely. A great introduction to the topic, for sure. Very accessible for, if you're not on the nerdy side like me, and you just want, some clear reading and an introduction to the concepts. It's a great book to look at. Likewise, as well, for scholars and undergrads, it's a great resource. So, yeah, everybody go check that book out. Um, but, Catherine, Christy, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a great conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank
And
you.